All right, good afternoon. I've got about one afternoon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Understanding the Basics of Licensing and Regulation of Direct Agricultural Product Sales. My name is Audrey Thompson, and I'm a staff attorney here with the Penn State Center for Agricultural and Shale Law. We are a legal and academic research outlet for legal ag stakeholders and rural communities, and we provide much of our content through our website at aglaw.psu.edu. Here we publish the Agricultural and Shale Law weekly reviews, which cover recent ag and energy legal developments and include a full listing of relevant state and national legislation and executive branch publications. We also host our Ag Law virtual resource rooms, which provide a compilation of resources on a singular topic in agricultural or energy law. And we have our issue trackers, which provide a timeline of developments on a single issue so you can see that issue developing through statutes, regulation, and case law. And we produce audio and video content with our Ag Law podcast and our Farmland Energy Legal podcast. These are available on all of the major podcast platforms and our YouTube channel, where we will post a recording of this webinar. I also want to let you know that under our events page, if you hover over events and click on past events, you will be able to see where we post the PowerPoints and other materials from the presentations after each event. So don't miss out on any of this great content. We encourage you to subscribe for updates to all of our products, to stay on the center's mailing list and stay updated on our publications and events. One last plug for the Center for Agricultural and Shale Law. We also operate the Pennsylvania Agricultural Mediation Program, which is funded through the USDA. This program has historically facilitated mediations between ag producers and the USDA, but its authorization has been expanded over the last several years, and we are now able to mediate a broader range of issues between different parties. So please feel free to reach out to Jackie Schweikler, our program coordinator, with any questions about ag mediation. Today's webinar on licensing and regulation of direct agricultural product sales is part of the Center's Understanding Agricultural Law series, a course of webinars designed to provide subject matter literacy and competence on fundamental issues of agricultural law to attorneys and business advisors who work with or represent ag or rural clients, but who may not necessarily specialize in agricultural law. This series is wholly sponsored by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's Ag Business Development Center, which was established through the 2019 Pennsylvania Farm Bill. The Ag Business Development Center aims to enhance the long-term vitality of Pennsylvania farms by supporting farm transitions, both from generation to generation and from conventional to organic farming, supporting beginning farmers, providing risk management education, and providing financial assistance through low-interest loans and grants. This is the 9th webinar in the Understanding Ag Law series. Previous topics include ag labor laws, farmland leasing for energy development, land use regulation for ag, legal protections for ag operations, ag cooperatives, livestock market regulations, crop insurance, and conservation programs. Recordings of all of these webinars are available on our YouTube site. We have a few topics coming up here. We have Understanding the Basics of Ag Finance and Pennsylvania's Clean and Green Preferential Tax Assessment Program on February 24th. Registration for the January event is already open on our events page. I will now turn this webinar over to Brook Duer, the Center's senior staff attorney. Brook joined the Center for Agricultural and Shale Law in 2019. Prior to coming to the center, Brook served as the chief counsel for Pennsylvania's Department of Agriculture. And before joining PDA, he practiced law in Lancaster County for 18 years. Brook routinely publishes and presents throughout the state on agricultural issues and serves as the mainstay commentator for the Center's Agricultural Law podcast. Brook, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Good afternoon, everybody. And we will succeed in teaching Audrey, who is from Missouri, how to pronounce Lancaster. There's a guy named Burt Lancaster who was an actor once, but he has nothing to do with the town or the county. So,
I apologize. It's Lancaster. It's Lancaster.
Yeah, Lancaster.
Right? Okay.
That's it. So, all right, we're going to talk about the basics of licensing and regulation of ag product sales. And again, what we're really talking about is when you see all these farm markets and other ag producers who are engaging in direct sales in different venues and in different ways, we're going to try to answer the question and give you some of those basic fundamentals of how and when and who provides them with their licenses or permissions to do these things, depending on what they're doing. In other words, how is this industry regulated? So it's not real complex in Pennsylvania. This is a thing that is pretty much left to the states with some overriding federal guidance that comes from some of the technical food codes, and we'll talk about all of that. But it is a product of state law. So this is going to be really honing in on Pennsylvania's requirements for when do you have to have a license and what are the basic parameters when you have a license to essentially engage in direct sales to consumers. And this applies, what we're going to talk about today is also, it's applicable to ready to eat foods, meaning things that you're going to buy and eat on site, but also to foods that you would take home and consume later. And let me make sure my camera is on. There you go. I forgot to put the camera on. Okay, so the basic regulatory scheme in Pennsylvania is administered by the Bureau of Food Safety, which is part of PDA, of course. You know, in eons past, there was actually a time when this function was under the Pennsylvania Department of Health a long, long time ago. And some of that terminology sort of still hangs around with regard to the other types of health departments that exist at county and local levels. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But for the state, you're starting at PDA's Bureau of Food Safety, and they're enforcing most of the applicable laws to direct ag product sales, whether raw or processed. Now, we're not going to talk about FSMA today because that's kind of a whole nother topic that has its own, hours and hours that we could spend talking about that. We're going to do this very discrete little regulatory function that comes from the state with regard to licensing essentially the retail sale and manufacturing of food products. Now, these blue boxes on the right-hand side of the screen sort of show you how this is how PDA has their website organized and into different regulatory categories or different program categories. And so that's just good to be familiar with that. And of course, you see in my PowerPoints, I always put links in. So you click on this Bureau of Food Safety, and that's going to take you right to their site. So, their mission statement is that their mission is to protect and keep food safe from the farm to the fork by educating and regulating and ensuring compliance with food safety laws and regulations. So that's what we're here to talk about. And the Bureau has several divisions where each provides important oversight to the production and service of safe food. And so the first thing, there's a milk division, obviously, there's an eggs, fruit, and vegetables, which is kind of a little catch-all for, I've mistakenly moved my slide, there we go, which is sort of a catch-all for the other things that might be sold that have individual requirements. And then the retail food inspection reports and the retail food category, that's a big one. And that's one of the big ones we're going to talk about. And then the food manufacturing, packing, and holding is the other big area that we're going to talk about. And when do you need registrations, et cetera, and what are the requirements? Obviously, the Bureau of Food Safety has a big food safety lab that is involved in all sorts of testing. And then this is the place, PDA's Food Safety Bureau is, of course, the place where complaints about food safety issues are made. And then consumer protection is sort of a catch-all for other types of food-related information and programming that the Bureau does. Okay, let's get going. This is the way the Food Safety Bureau is organized. And it's got these different regions, and Region 6 here has been cut up into several different subsections, as is Region 7. And that's sort of the southeast portion of the state, but you get the idea. And here's Region 4 also has 2 subsections. And this is really how it works. The regional employees that are not located in Harrisburg are a huge part of the Bureau of Food Safety, because they're dealing with all of the registered either retail food facilities or food establishments, 2 terms which we will define in a minute, in their jurisdictions. So while, of course, the data and everything is kept in Harrisburg in a central, electronic filing system, which we'll talk about, the actual boots on the ground are the local people. So if you are in Armstrong County, for example, and or if somebody is in Armstrong County and they are looking to obtain a retail food facility license because they want to have a farm market, then when they call in, they will be assigned to a person from Region 4N out there, and whose supervisor would be Robert Delancey, as you see in this breakdown of the state. And it would be some employee that would generally be what's called a food sanitarian who works in Armstrong County and is a local person. So you're really dealing with locals. The licensing end goes through Harrisburg for sort of supervisory and the actual issuance of licenses, registrations, et cetera. But the day-to-day, and telling you what you need to do to comply, for example, that comes from the local employees. So this is really a decentralized type of system, which does provide local service. It's not all just coming from Harrisburg. So now, this is probably a item that is good to I showed this early. I've done this presentation one other time, and it's good to show this early because the PA Food Safety website is a new thing since about, we'll just call most of the major changes that have gone on with regard to the food safety regulation system in Pennsylvania went on in the late 2000s and early 2000 teens. And so in that period of time, basically Pennsylvania, there was an Auditor General report actually in the early to mid 2000s when the fact that all of the inspection reports for restaurants, food stores, et cetera, were not easy to be obtained or not easily accessible by the public or by others in the industry. And so that it was all computerized into a centralized database. And this is the address for it here. And so you can look at inspection reports from any retail food store or any restaurant, pizza shop, whatever, from the tiniest little things to the largest operations. And you can even look at the food manufacturers' inspection reports also. And this is the way the public goes in and gets them. And you can theoretically be standing in front of a restaurant or a farm stand or something, or I'll use the word farm market, and you can literally use your phone to sit there and look at the last time they were inspected by the state, and did they pass their inspection. So that was what the Auditor General was faulting the department for, and that's what was cured by this PA Food Safety website and the inspection database. So this is quite a movement towards public information, because all of these inspection reports are now open to the public, and that everything is a complete open book. And the follow-up inspections, see whether they passed again. And that's why you see many of the newspapers who run this kind of thing too, where they pull them right off of this website and they run them in their local paper to show, what local food stores or restaurants have, how they fared in their latest inspections. And this has a long history going way back as to the early 2000s, or at least the mid 2000s, because that's when the electronic versions of these inspection reports began, and they're still with us. Prior to that, it was in fact paper. So that's a big thing. The PA Food Safety Inspection Database, completely, totally publicly accessible. All right, now the primary laws that are enforced by PDA, there's the Retail Food Facility Safety Act, and then there's the Food Safety Act. And they're two different things. I'll explain what they are. And these were both passed in, I think it was 2010, and that's when the whole recodification occurred of Pennsylvania's regulation of restaurants and food manufacturers and food stores. That all happened approximately 2010. That was during the period when I was at PDA, and legislature recodified everything and repealed the old vestiges of what had been there before. And so the attempt was to make this simple and easier to understand, and I think it was relatively successful. These two laws do two different things, and I'll show you the table of contents for them in a minute, which will explain that. Basically, the buried in them, of course, there is the PA Food Code, which is in fact essentially an incorporation by reference of what's called the Model Food Code. There are some slight differences in the Pennsylvania Food Code from the Model Food Code, some little things that had to be done on an individual state basis. But for the most part, this Model Food Code, which is, I think the most current version is the 2017 version from FDA. You see the little, this is actually how the cover looks on the right-hand side of the slide. That's the Model Food Code. That has all the technical requirements with regard to how you prepare, manufacture, hold food, serve food in a restaurant setting, deliver food, ready to eat food even in a store setting, how you handle food in a store setting, like meat in the case, and all those sorts of things. So and nowadays one of the reasons for doing this recodification was that we had so many facilities that were not only retail food facilities, but also selling ready-to-eat food. The revolution in the grocery industry is that they're not only giving you the food to take home and make, but they're making food there for you to take and eat right now, or to eat on site, or to eat, in your car, or eat at home, or take out, or whatever. So, food stores have become restaurants essentially. And so this was part of the justification for all of this. And again, the one good thing about having such a thing as the Model Food Code is that for the most part, that's from state to state to state, there's a certain amount of consistency there, because the model of incorporating the Model Food Code from FDA into the individual state enforcement mechanisms is pretty uniform across the country. Now, the two acts that we're talking about, the Retail Food Facility Act is just the act that deals with the retail sale of food in a restaurant or store. And then the Food Safety Act is a broader set of requirements, including the administrative requirements for the Retail Food Facility Act. And you can see some of these titles in the table of contents. These are universally applicable titles. But then there are also, right in here, you see there's a in the Food Safety Act, there's a section here called Registration of Food Establishments. That is essentially the registration of all food manufacturers, storage facilities, warehouses, etc. So that is kind of the other big category besides retail food facilities that are regulated by this act on the left. There are the food establishments, which is essentially everything else that holds food that doesn't deliver it to a customer, such as a manufacturer, a storage facility, a warehouse, etc. They're all regulated here as part of the Food Safety Act. So generally applicable Food Safety Act provisions, some very specific ones, just the food manufacturers, and then on the left is the restaurant and food store provisions. And as you see, in comparative terms, these are very small statutes. This is a very, fairly uncomplicated area, which is a testament to what was accomplished back around 2010 when it was all recodified, just to try to make the public be able to understand this in a much easier way. Now, what is a retail food facility? Okay, a public eating and drinking place, that doesn't mean anything anymore. That was the old term that used to be used in the old regulatory scheme, or a retail food establishment. Okay, so there you got, it's the old definition within a definition. Now you got to go to, okay, so what's a retail food establishment? Gets very confusing because the word, establishment is in there. And so we call them retail food facilities, but you're using this definition essentially. An establishment that stores, prepares, packages, vends, offers for sale, or otherwise provides food for human consumption, which relinquishes, and this is the key qualifier, which relinquishes possession of the food to the consumer directly or indirectly. In other words, gives you a plate with a steak on it, or gives you a grocery bag with a packaged steak on it that you take home and cook. And it includes through delivery services such as home delivery. So the idea was that that's equally regulated. Or a delivery service provided by common carriers. So if you're buying all your, groceries by, and they're delivered by, now you got Whole Foods and, Amazon being one and the same essentially. And so that counts as relinquishing possession of the food to the consumer directly when it is shipped to you. Doesn't include dining cars on railroad lines or interstate commerce or a bed and breakfast, homestead, or inn. Okay, that's just a little exception. So that's what a retail food facility is. That's the word. You can't say it enough times. That is the magic word for regulatory purposes, retail food facility. And that is a restaurant or a store. And it encompasses anything that would fit in within that very broad definition. Okay, the other big area, the regulated entity is what's called a food establishment. So that's why I try to drive home the difference in the terminology, retail food facility versus food establishment. A food establishment, and by the way, I got one little point to make. A retail food facility needs what's called a license. It is an actual license, whereas a food establishment is a registration. There are some differences in, if we have attorneys on the line, that there's property interest, what do we want to say? Some fine criteria with regard to what's a property interest for the purposes of legal, issues. Bottom line is just understand food establishment registration, retail food facility license. Okay, a food establishment is any room, building, or place, or portion thereof, or vehicle that, in other words, a truck, a refrigerated truck or something, or vehicle maintained, used, or operated for the purpose of commercially storing, packaging, making, mixing, cooking, processing, bottling, baking, canning, freezing, packaging, or otherwise preparing, transporting, or handling food. So trucks on the highway that are carrying food are technically under the jurisdiction, or they are part of a food establishment. And they themselves are subject to the same kind of inspection. The term excludes retail food facilities. Okay, so we know that that's excluded, and some other language that doesn't exist anymore. And those, meaning the public and eating and drinking places, and those portions of establishments that are operating exclusively under milk or milk products permits. So food establishment has one big exception under the law, which is essentially the production and processing of milk and milk products. So those are the two big sort of buzzwords to understand. Now, I always like to say this one because this is such a funny thing. Everyone has seen this on little baked goods, particularly. You see this thing that says registered Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, usually with an abbreviation like this. And of course, most of us know that PA is the abbreviation for Pennsylvania, not this. So, this goes back decades when you see this printed on something. And you'll see it on like a little, tasty cake, or I shouldn't say that because tasty cake's from Philadelphia, but you'll see it on a little Debbie cake that's made in California and sold in California and has nothing to do with Pennsylvania. Why is this on here? The answer to that question, or why do people use this in other states? The answer to that question is lost in the annals of time. But at some point, post-Depression, it was sort of a badge of cleanliness that that your food manufacturing process was somehow registered with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. So, hey, great, feather in our cap. Why that was considered to be some type of badge of cleanliness is a little bit lost, in history. But the bottom line is the act tip of the cap to this old thing, which there was no requirement to use this in Pennsylvania law prior to 2010 or even today. It's simply a thing that the law decided to, okay, we'll make reference to this. We will say that you can use this if you are a food manufacturer, meaning a food establishment. They are allowed to label if they are in fact registered with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. They can use that acronym, or I shouldn't say acronym, that little designation, abbreviation, as I guess it's called here. And so that's what that's all about. Everybody asks that. I mean, from the time I came to the Department of Agriculture, it was always, what's that little thing that it says there? What does that mean? It meant nothing. And it still means nothing other than it's registered with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. It's not a required thing, and it doesn't mean anything more than the food manufacturing facility where this was made is registered under Pennsylvania's law. And so it also stopped everybody from other states from using it just willy-nilly, which was what was going on out there. Okay, retail food facilities. Everybody wants to know, okay, you sort of explained what the definition was. Now, what are the exemptions? Because everybody was all interested back when we were doing this act, and but we need exemptions. We need exemptions. Okay, so there are two very, very important exemptions. This goes to the heart of sort of direct sales of ag products. You have to understand these two exemptions to the retail food facility license requirement. The first is a retail food facility in which only prepackaged, non-potentially hazardous foods or beverages are sold. Okay, so that if you are only doing that, then you don't have to have a retail food facility license. Now, and that is why there are certain gas stations, let's say, who can get away with having the little, convenience store, inventory, because they're only selling. I should say they can get away with having the convenience store inventory without a license sometimes, because they're only selling prepackaged, non-potentially hazardous, which I'll get to that in a minute, food or beverages. Non-potentially hazardous there is a longer definition for it, but essentially what it means is things that do not have to be regulated by time or temperature controls. And in a layperson's viewpoint, it means meat or dairy or other things of that nature that are made from meat or dairy products that can spoil and potentially, become contaminated simply by sitting on a shelf, with various, pathogens and other things that may, grow. So the bottom line is, it's, lunch meat sandwiches, even though they're prepackaged, if they have meat products in them, then they're technically not within this particular category. So when you have the hot dog roller at the convenience store, that's why they have to have a license, and they can't get it. They don't meet the exemption is because they got the hot dog sitting there, and that is not a prepackaged, non-potentially hazardous food. Okay, so that next is a retail food facility doesn't need a license if it sells only raw agricultural commodities. Now, that's really important because every farm market, farmer's market stand that is run by a producer, et cetera, if they are sticking to only raw agricultural commodities, then they don't need a retail food facility license. That's sort of the tip of the hat, historically to farm markets. That is a cultural, tradition in, and an economic tradition, and part of our, part of our culture and the commerce in agriculture that is done, and to intrude into that by making someone have a license was viewed as, not where Pennsylvania wanted to go. So there are many farm markets, let's say out at the end of the lane that do not have retail food facility licenses because they're only selling raw agricultural commodities. But if there's processing going on, you're making baked goods or you're doing any kind of processing to those raw agricultural commodities, then you don't qualify. And so, you got the canned, beets or green beans or whatever it is that maybe is also sold at that farm market. Then that's a different story. Those are not raw agricultural commodities. Those are processed in some way. The finer line where it gets a little sticky is when things are only cut. and they're just simply trimmed, cut, prepared for sale. They're still the raw form, and maybe they were just simply cut in certain ways, and then there can be some gray areas. I mean, if you ever see Brussels sprouts in their normal growth, in their completely raw form, that's not something that you ever see in a store. But just to cut the little sprouts off, is that enough of a processing to essentially say that facility, if that's all they're doing, that is in the nature of processing, does that, knock them out of the exemption? It's a good question. I mean, there are some fine lines in that area. Okay, now there are two other big ways that exemptions occur. One is through an order from the Secretary of Agriculture. PDA issues exemptions. And then secondly, and they have issued a list, which I'll go over. And then secondly, there is a potential that you may not be regulated by PDA because you're regulated by a local government unit, a county or local health department, which I'll get to in a second. And they have their own authority under Pennsylvania law to issue their own exemptions for their jurisdiction. Now, let me get to that because that's an important aspect of the entire food safety licensing and regulation process, is this local and county health department thing. So what we have is, we have that map of Pennsylvania. Okay. The assumption and the backdrop is that every place that doesn't have a local health department of some kind that has voluntarily decided to be in the business of licensing and inspecting retail food facilities, just those, then if they have decided to get into that business, then they are the licensor, not PDA, and you have to deal with their licensing process, not PDA's licensing process, and you have to deal with their potential food code, which might be slightly different. For example, Philadelphia County has a huge food code, totally, very, very different from what PDA enforces in its areas of jurisdiction. So here's the county, Allegheny County and Pittsburgh, same thing. And many other counties. County and local health departments, there's 110 in total. So it's like it's like a jigsaw puzzle. There used to be a good map, but it changes so often that you can't even really maintain a map, because a lot of these locals who at one time were doing this because it was perceived as a nice service from local government to do their own restaurant inspections or their own retail store inspections, they're getting out of the business as budgets get tighter and tighter and tighter. So, and once they just decide they're not going to do it anymore, then PDA has to take over. So it's a one of the classic unfunded mandate, to some degree from PDA that they have to take the jurisdiction if the locals give it up. And just to dispel the thought, the licensing and registration fees that PDA brings in do not pay in any. There's an available fund. It does not begin to cover the expenses of all of this, or the cost of all of this. So there's a spreadsheet on PDA's website where you can look up the county and local health departments. Here's an example of the counties that have them, or these are the counties. And here's the major municipalities. These are just examples because there are many more. So unless you're in one of these, you're regulated by PDA, and that's where your license comes from, and you're subject to PDA's version of the food code, and you're also subject to PDA's or the exemptions that PDA has are available. If you're in any of these other jurisdictions, there are local exemption lists that you have to consult. Now, so here again, that's the statewide PDA jurisdiction exemptions. It's the two that I talked to you before: raw agricultural products and prepackaged non-potentially hazardous. In other words, no meat or dairy. That's a very I'm sure there are food safety experts out there that would tell me I'm not being thorough with that, but food and dairy is enough for or meat and dairy is enough for our discussion. Now, PDA jurisdictions are subject to a published set of exemptions that were issued, and here's the date of the latest exemption order. There were some before, operates no more than 3 days per calendar year. So it's for these, sporadic, the church, basement, bake sale, all that kind of stuff. Food bank owned by a charitable nonprofit operated for charitable religious purposes, or a soup kitchen owned by a charitable nonprofit and operated for charitable religious purposes. So they're exempt from the retail food facility license requirement also. Charitable nonprofit that is established to promote and encourage participation in extracurricular recreation activities for youth. So all of this, the band supporters and the soccer team doing their bake sale and all that kind of stuff, and maybe they're doing even things like a pancake breakfast or whatever. So those are exempted from the license requirement. However, take a look at the bottom. A retail food facility that is exempt from license requirements under this act is exempt from the licensure requirements only, remains subject to inspection and all other provisions of the act. So the soccer, team's auxiliary, pancake breakfast is still subject to being inspected by PDA food sanitarians to make sure that food safety, is being served by their operation. Or maybe I should not use the word serve, that food safety is, or food safety requirements are being complied with in their operation. Other exemptions, food or beverage sold only through a vending machine. Okay, so that's the whole, sort of the little lunchroom that you might have in a large employer where you have all those vending machines sitting in there and, some tables and there's napkins and, maybe some plastic, cutlery and it's sort of the lunchroom. Well, that can be exempt, but and in fact, that will exempt you even for those sandwiches that have meat products in them that are packaged and sold in the vending machine. So that's sort of a little way that the whole, non-potentially hazardous food prepackaged can be sold in a circumstance where there is no license involved, but of course, the company that stocks the vending machine has a license. Anyway, school cafeterias are actually exempt also in the PDA jurisdictions. That's an interesting one. People not to say the school cafeterias are not inspected, because they are. And again, that's what this last little coda at the end is trying to get across. Now, you'll probably be thinking in your head, what about food trucks? What about, fairs and carnivals? We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, now, individual jurisdictions, let's go back. The individual jurisdictions that we had back here, they will have their own list of exemptions. So if you're concerned with a retail food facility there, you got to look up their exemptions and see. Sometimes they might have more exemptions. Maybe they have less. Philadelphia is very tight. So all right. The retail food facility license application that PDA has on their website is your Bible. That is, and it's a multi-portion package, so to speak, or packet of materials. There's a retail food facility and restaurants and then there's also a change of owner type of application that explains what you do when you're acquiring a business and there's a change of owner. You have to file things with the state. Application package for a remodeling, because if you're changing the interior conditions of your food surface, your food preparation and service facilities, you are going to have your remodeling plan essentially filed with the state, and what exactly it is that you're doing in there all approved as part of your ongoing license obligations. And there's also a package for shared facilities where you may have a shared kitchen where multiple people are doing things together. So that's a great resource. Retail food facility license application terms have to be submitted at least 60 days before the service or prep of any food at a retail food facility. The biggest requirements, there's water and sewer requirements, and then there's a HACCP plan requirement. A HACCP plan is a hazardous, controlled, I wish I should know it off the top of my head, but the critical control points, hazardous analysis, critical control points. I may not have gotten the A right there, but basically I have a slide on that in a minute and I'll show you. These are the water and sewer requirements, and that can be a big issue sometimes. You have to have water samples, if you're not part of a public water system, and you have to have testing samples, et cetera. And then it's all explained right there. And here's some of the fees, just so you get an idea this is the PDA fee, new licensee for a retail food facility, $103 for under 50 seats and owner operated. Anything else, like maybe it's a franchise or it's more than 50, it's $241. And then there are other fees for various other things. Plan review is a big thing because part of the application is they have to look at the entire plan of your operation, the layout, what equipment you have, how you prepare the food. All this has to be laid out to get the license. And that's a no charge function. In other words, that's the food sanitarian working with you or people in the Harrisburg office working with you on getting everything right. And then here's other, fees there. It just gives you a sense of what we're talking about ballpark. Okay, a HACCP plan is essentially anytime you're doing some type of, more complex, food preparation process that has the potential to go, you have to say it had to go wrong at some point, then that's when HACCP plans come into being for a retail food facility. These are some of the things that can get you into needing a HACCP plan, specialized processes that are done at retail, as they call them. This best thing to say is I'm no expert, and you might want to talk to Penn State Extension if need be to try to get some education on HACCP plans. It's an entire industry unto itself, and it's going to be needed if you're doing any of these kind of specialized processes. Okay, other good things that PDA has available. Labeling at the retail food facility level is a huge issue, not only for positive protections, from, let's say, liability claims and allergens, and allergens required labeling, but so there's voluntary labeling. It's just good for you to do as a business, but then there are required labels and like allergens. And so there's a great set of these kind of flow charts that tell you what you need to be labeling and what is okay to not label, and how the labels have to read, etc. There's a lot to know and to study there, and it's a big issue when you're opening a facility. And there's guidelines on PDA's website about sampling, and there's also about the sale and stocking and keeping of eggs. And there's a thing called the egg refrigeration law, and although sometimes it's a little controversial in the food industry whether eggs need to be refrigerated, and if so, at what temperatures and how long. So bottom line is lots of good resources, and here they are. Just click on the links. Okay, now that's retail food facilities. Now let's talk about food establishments. Food establishments are the manufacturers, totally separate category. PDA has a big package with regard to food establishments that is very self-explanatory. Same basic requirements, the 60 days in advance of any kind of prep. Same water and sewer requirements, no HACCP plan, because the manufacturing processes, for the most part, are dealt with very specifically in the parts of the Model Food Code, the federal regulations that apply to food manufacturers. And it's the CFR Title 21. It has all the standards of identity for food, which is what you have to comply with to call the food a certain thing. And then good manufacturing practices, these GMPs, for the manufacturing of all kinds of different foods. And it's, the CFR is just packed with this stuff. That's where it all comes from. And so now, key thing to understand, food establishments where you're manufacturing, storing, et cetera, but not delivering to a customer, those are all regulated by PDA statewide, one regulator. None of the local health departments are not involved. Okay, and I should put it this way, that I shouldn't say it that definitively. When the law came into being, the deal was, or I shouldn't put it that way. I don't want to get this wrong. No, actually, I'll say it this way. Food establishments are, in fact, all regulated by PDA. Sometimes within a jurisdiction, they will cede, in other words, hand over and allow PDA to be the regulator for food, for retail food facility purposes in that jurisdiction when you have a food establishment and a retail food facility in the same location. Okay, I wanted to make sure I got that one right. So the bottom line is there's a little bit of cooperation so that you're not subject to duplicative requirements if you do both of these things. And it's like, what, I'm going to have PDA in here and the Delaware County Health Department in here to inspect different parts. And no, that's been, for the most part, worked out. I'm not aware of what jurisdictions maybe have not worked that out with PDA, but I think it's been worked out in all jurisdictions. I could be wrong because time, it took many years to, after the law became the law, to work all that out. So, all right, limited food establishments. What's that? That is the home kitchen preparation. That is the people who make baked goods in less than what is one of these large manufacturing facilities that's compliant with all of those CFR federal code requirements. And there is an allowance for limited food establishments in Pennsylvania. Limited food establishments are not something that the CFR even recognizes, or that FDA even recognizes. That's sort of an invention of state jurisdictions to have this idea of a home kitchen, a residential style kitchen that isn't going to meet the full regulatory code requirements of the CFR for manufacturing, but the judgment is that it can be made safe through application of the Food Safety Act, Pennsylvania's Food Safety Act, and our regulations. And then, many of those borrowed things from the federal code also, of course, come into play. And so the bottom line is that's what a limited food establishment is versus a food establishment, which is, all manufacturers, and then limited food establishment is a subset of a manufacturer, which is sort of the home kitchen type, small food manufacturer. And there's a lot of movement in this area, and there are organizations out there that, fight for this as, sort of an aspect of, libertarian concerns and, and civil rights issues, that you have this right to make and sell food. In this kind of, there are activists in this area who really, are interested in, pushing this particular area and the rights of those who want to do it. It's become sort of a thing these days. So again, same type of thing. You get their application for PDA and you study it and you comply with it and you work your way through it. And your client or you, if you're the one, it's just got to be done. There's a certain amount of this food safety, regulatory requirements that you just have to buckle down and know and understand and employ, or you're not going to get your license or your registration. So now there are also mobile units and temporary units, two different things. Basically, a temporary is operating for no more than 14 days in duration, whether consecutive or non-consecutive, in a fixed location, not moving, and in other words, not a mobile unit of some kind, and in conjunction with an event or celebration. In other words, this is a fair where they might have an actual structure, not just a food truck pulling up, and other types of things of that nature. Can't be more than 14 days, or you disqualify yourself from the temporary retail food facility license. Also in the mobile end, you have similar rules, which is can't be operated at a location for more than 14 consecutive days, whether continuously or not during this time period. So you have to watch how you manage these temporaries and mobiles so that you don't overstay in one location and then end up disqualifying yourself from that license category. So that's essentially where mobiles and temporaries fit in, and that's such a huge growth area these days, of course. And they're licensed just as a subpart of retail food facilities, just like the limited food establishments in the home kitchen are a subpart of the larger food establishment, food manufacturing world. Okay, farmers markets. The big transformation in 2010 was that Pennsylvania took individual farmers market stands and called them retail food facilities, each one, as opposed to the prior practice, which was that the entire farmers market got one license as a retail food facility, and they were called, I think, retail food stores back then. And and that was difficult. One of the very difficult parts of that was that, if a foodborne illness came from somewhere in the market, you could have 50 vendors, one license. You didn't have a way to administer, let's say, the penalties for something that would occur, because there's only one license, and that's not even held by the, by the vendor who may have been the responsible party, and people who were not responsible at all might get, sucked into the enforcement because they just happen to be a vendor there. So it didn't make sense. It needed to be transformed. It wasn't easy, but it was transformed. Individual farmers market stand holders now are all individually licensed as a retail food facility. And that's where there's been some friction with the individual county and local health departments, because sometimes, there is, particularly if you have a person that's going to 6 different farmers markets throughout the course of the week, or that's a lot. But some people have the staffing to do that. Let's say you're even going to 3, you might be in different counties. You could be, having different permutations of your tear down and setup in terms of how sophisticated your circumstances are. Some farmers markets have stands where there's running water, some don't. There's all kinds of different variables in this thing, all of which haven't been made perfect. And there is still the potential that you have to have one license from every jurisdiction where you work. In other words, let's say you have those multiple farmers market stands. In other words, there was a lot of attention to and effort to try to get a system where there just simply be one license and it would be honored in all these other jurisdictions. That has not been achieved completely and totally. However, talk to your local health department if you have one and find out how they're dealing with that particular issue. There is not always communication between all of them, and you may move around the state pretty large, pretty far, counties that are not even contiguous to each other. So that's still an issue that you've got to work your way through. Okay, that's there is a farmers market application. Okay, now this is just breaking down the components again of the PDA's retail food program. We talked about retail food facilities, so the restaurants and the stores. Farmers market stands, that's a subset of retail food facilities just for farmers market stand holders. That we talked about mobile food facilities and the fairs and other type of temporary setups. Those are, again, all subtypes of retail food facilities. There's a couple other little things that go on in the Bureau of Food Safety. There's a frozen dessert license. So if you're running a soft serve ice cream machine, for example, or other types of things of that nature, Italian ice type machines, even the slushy machines. Now, I forget this latest on slushy machines at the convenience stores as to whether they're qualifying as frozen dessert license required, facilities, so to speak. But the bottom line is it exists. So if you're getting into that, you need to know that. Now, we talked about HACCP plans. Now let's talk about food employee certification, because that's a big one. You see that in a lot of inspection reports. Okay, there's an entire separate act for that called the Food Employee Certification Act. Requires one employee per licensed retail food facility to have a food employee certification certificate, and safe serve and all. And there's a bunch of names in that industry for the people that offer those courses and offer those certificates. And PDA has a website, or on their website, I should say, they have an entire page devoted to the course listings where you can get those certifications. Now, it has to be one person per facility, and their certificate has to be posted, and that person has to be available during all hours of operation. They don't have to physically be there, but they need to be available to be brought there, particularly if the inspector has showed up and there's a problem. Here are the exemptions from the food employee certification requirements. You're only selling commercially prepackaged food. Okay, that's kind of what we're talking about with regard to the gas station convenience store that doesn't have the hot dog roller, and so because that's not a commercially prepackaged food, but if otherwise that's what they're selling. Okay, Retail food facilities that handle only, and this is the non-potentially hazardous food. Sometimes they're called non-time temperature controlled for safety. I had made reference to that terminology before. Essentially, no meat or dairy there, or you're going to lose your exemption from the food employee certification. All food manufacturing facilities, they don't need food employee certifications. This is just for retail food facilities, because those massive regulations in the CFR that are that they operate subject to cover or is viewed to cover what's needed to be covered in terms of food safety. And you don't have the sort of turnover of employees. And, if you're in a large food manufacturer, it is clearly in their best interest to train you properly and make sure you're doing it right. Or, they may not be in business too long. Whereas retail food facilities, how it is. It's a little different thing. You got the high school kids, you got everybody working in there. So, and then also there is, a nonprofit and a tax exempt status exemption for the food employee certification requirement. And you go in this anytime you go to a restaurant, look for it. It should be posted, and it might be expired. And you see it in the reports all the time that, people are getting written up daily for not having proper certification posted. It's expired. The employee left, 3 months ago. It happens all the time. Okay, one thing to just also be very, very aware of in Pennsylvania, which is that every single license registration that the Pennsylvania Bureau of Food Safety is responsible for has a requirement that you have to have a Pennsylvania sales tax license. So I have a link here. Just read it. Read the requirements, know the requirements, and get your state tax license, your sales tax license, because you aren't going to get your proper approvals from PDA without it. Period. End of discussion. Okay, that is the core content of what we wanted to get across here today, just to give people that idea of what how is this industry regulated in its basic form, and that's it. We have a couple of things coming up here. Understanding Ag Law series, this series that we're talking about here, which the next one is January 27th, Understanding Basics of Ag Finance. And we're going to have probably a separate one on the farm credit system. Then that will be later in the year. We also have a quarterly dairy legal update that we also offer for CLEs, just like these Understanding Ag Law series. And the next ones I'm going to do on the IMS system, Interstate Regulation of Milk Production and Processing, which kind of, fits a little bit with this, because it is there's this exemption for milk and milk products under the food establishment. Well, now we're going to talk about how are all those milk plants regulated, and how does this entire system of milk going all over the country, how is it regulated from the food safety standpoint, so to speak, as opposed to pricing, which we've all probably been exposed to in some way, shape, or form. Okay, and we have our big event, or one of our biggest events of the year coming up, which is this is our third annual Pennsylvania Farm Show Agricultural Law Symposium. 4 CLE credits total for that event, 2 hours on 2 separate afternoons. It's the Tuesday and Thursday of Farm Show this year, January 10th and 12th. And all you got to do is go to our web page here, and you'll see right across the home page, there's banners that sort of a rotating carousel of images where you can look at all of our different webinar series, including one for the Farm Show Agricultural Law Symposium. So with that having been said,
all right,
Audrey,
thank you so much, Brooke. And thank you all for joining us this snowy day here in Pennsylvania. Again, join us again in all of our upcoming events, especially the Pennsylvania Farm Show. We've had some questions about the resources and the PowerPoint. Those are being posted right now. And we will also send out a follow-up email to all attendees with the link for those resources. And we'll send up another email with the recording link as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.